Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to this episode of The Wisdom of. We try to highlight leaders in all sorts of different industries and walks of life on The Wisdom of, and in an increasingly fractured world, complex world, politically, socially, economically, uncertain world that we live in right now, we need now more than ever to transfer wisdom from those that have walked a path, have earned their stripes, and have done some things that are worthy of noting. But I'm particularly excited about today's episode because today's guest is Pam Johnson, and Pam has represented the agricultural industry post her career as a registered nurse, having worked and built the family farm with her husband, which now has transitioned to her two boys. I'll talk about Pam's bio in a little bit, but I come from a long multi-generational family of farmers in Western Australia, and I don't think we talk enough, or we have enough opportunity for people to understand just how complex the business of farming is, both scientifically, economically, and in so many other ways. And so welcome, Pam, and I'll talk a little bit about your history in a minute, but I'm so excited to have you here, the opportunity to feature farmers particularly, and farming as a critical aspect of community, right? And a critical aspect of any kind of national or country-based position, its ability to actually feed its own population. Food security is critical. So welcome, and thank you so much for giving us this time.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. So in the fractured world we live in, one person that always impressed me was, I was at a conference once, and it was a woman from the Philippines, and she said, she was a farmer, leaders come and go, governments come and go. Our work, who we are, continues. And that has always stuck with me.
Yeah, because people have to be fed. Food keeps growing. Nature is nature. And, food security is just such an issue for a country. And against that critical backdrop of, farming is just this constant thing that has to happen. Let me just give a bit of your background, Pam. You have a 1,150 acre farm in Iowa, and that really is farming territory. But in 2013, you became the first female president of the National Corn Growers Association, which is not an insignificant thing because farming has for many, for years, decades, been a predominantly male industry. So, the associations for the various farm bodies would have a very strong tradition, I think, of electing probably men to the role. So not insignificant in the United States to become the first female president. You worked with members of Congress to work on the Farm Bill for 2014. I'd love to, kind of grab some essence of what the Farm Bill was trying to capture. And then you also went on to help found MAIZALL. MAIZALL, have I correct?
MAIZALL, yes. Mm-hmm.
International Maize Alliance of Corn Growers Associations. And so founding an international body that brings together the national bodies is not an insignificant thing at all. John Doggett, the former NCGA CEO, said, not many people can go from the farm to the halls of Congress, do the hard work, and few remember they are still from the farm and representing their friends, neighbours, and fellow farmers. And so, there's so many more things, but I'd really love to get into the conversation that we're here to have, which is about, the wisdom that you've accrued over that time, both moving from nursing onto the farm with your husband, building the farm with your husband, now transitioning to your sons who had their own properties and, trying to bring all of that together, to working with Congress on a parliamentary bill, public policy, and then leading a national association and founding an international association. They're not insignificant activities, and we could change that word a little bit, association, and talk about leading a national organizational business, leading an international and co-founding an international organization or business. So values always comes front and center for leaders.
Yes.
What are the values that have been most important to you as you've done this work and built this representation and built this, this body of work that you've done over the years? What have been the critical values that you've judged yourself by?
Well, first of all, Simon, I would say I'm an ordinary person that have the opportunity to do extraordinary things.
Hmm.
And I love working with other people, sitting around the table. I might have an idea, but the product that comes from a lot of people sitting around a table and everybody sharing is much better than an individual project. And I love bringing things to life out of nothing, right? Like organizing MAIZALL, and was a founding member of the uh, Foundation for Food and Ag Research um, business, well, nonprofit. And that to me is what makes my brain sparkle, is when you can put a stake in the ground and say, how do my life skills interact with what the world needs? And so I've just been lucky enough, and maybe not so smart sometimes, raising my hand and saying, yes, I'll do it, because laying those challenges out, that here are the issues, who wants to step up? And to me, it was always intriguing.
Yeah, I did read I did read in an article where I'm going to find it, so I've got this correct. I did read in an article uh, where you were going to an event and you said to your husband, well, I'm going to say something. Something needs to be said. And so I guess the challenge for you hasn't been, well, it might have been, when people and circumstances were asking you to put your hand up. Did you have those moments where you resisted it and said, not me, not yet, not me? Or were you one of those people that just ran towards stuff and said, someone's got to do something and I'm going to do it?
No, so I'd have to back up and say I was one of the shyest kids in school, right? And wanted to lead from the edge, or not even lead, just be quiet and have nobody notice me. And I went to a leadership conference with Maurice one time, and it was a personality profiling. And it was done by colors, and there are different ways of doing it. Well, I
Yeah.
was in the blue group, and of all these 100 people there were 4 of us in the blue group. And everybody else was chit-chatting away, and making big plans. And we were just sitting there talking amongst ourselves. And she came over and she looked at us and smiled and said, you guys just like to hang out in the back of the room, don't you? And have nobody notice you. And we said, yes. She said, listen to me. The world needs you. You got to get out there. The world needs your personality style, even though you're like 4% of how people think and how they act. And that to me triggered something like, maybe I do have something to offer. And
Yeah.
so through the years, I've just gotten a little braver all the time, right? And I'm usually out of my comfort zone.
And were many of the rest of the people in the room red? Do you remember?
Yes.
That's
And
the
I
color.
can't remember the other number, colors,
Yeah.
orange, blue, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
There's a
the,
yellow,
the,
blue.
the noisy ones.
Yeah. It's color brain theory. And,
It's
the
like the
red,
ones that are going, look at me,
well,
I'm really spectacular.
yeah, the red are really about, let's make this, big outcome, but I'm going to make it happen, blah, 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 like almost the driven. The blue are the people that like connection, relationship, let's actually work together and things like that. And um, it's an interesting thing in today's world with AI. We were having a conversation last night around at home about AI is really going to take so many jobs, right? And
Mhm.
for decades, people have positioned themselves in the world on the back of their skill set, like what they can actually do from a skill set point of view. And what you've just highlighted, and certainly your history, is you've brought yourself to the table on the basis of who you are. So what is your unique humanness, if you like? And I think that's,
Bingo.
yeah.
Yes,
And I
I
think that's one of the
totally agree with
challenges.
you.
Yeah.
And companies and business can say, bring me a person with character. I can teach them the life skills they need,
Mm.
right? And that's what I truly believe. And early on, I like to read a lot, and I was reading James Autry's Servant Leadership.
Yeah.
Things like that just resonate with me about, you know, what does the world need, and then how can I help? What do I need to do?
Yeah.
Right? Always paying attention, always having your antenna up to see. And basically right now, Simon, it just, for me, boils down to being kind, you know?
Well, one of our core company values, Pam, is kindness. We have four values in our company, and one of them is kindness, and be complaint free. And because the world needs more of that. I think a lot of people have a lot of focus on AI and what's happening, but I love the idea of having an antenna up on who you are and what you can bring, rather than have the antenna solely on what the technology is doing and how do you fit into it. Trust is a human to human behavior. And, there's the whole conversation going on about, well, what can you trust these days when a video might not even be real? And so people have this mistrust in technology. And I think humans need to really think about how they bring themselves to the table as we move forward. What was that turning point? You haven't just led, and then I'm going to follow this up with specifically advice to young women, right? Particularly who might be in a male dominated field or in a field where, women haven't been in the leadership roles and they're moving down that path. But before we get to that, was there a turning point? Like, you showing up, but was there a turning point where you realized you really actually could influence the world of agriculture yourself, not because you and your husband have a farm, or I know he passed away in 2024, but because the two of you had a farm or you're in agriculture, but you actually, Pam Johnson, could make a difference. Was there some kind of turning point?
Yes, but not one silver bullet,
Okay.
like many turning points, right? So I think you alluded to the time where, there was a bankruptcy hearing and we went down and there were so many farmers that were hurt. And I knew that the perpetrators, it wouldn't faze them, right? And I was so angry. And I said to Maurice, I got to say something. So I stood up and spoke my piece about, I hope that these farmers' faces rotate through your mind all night tonight, because who you've hurt, this is life-changing for them. And that was one turning point. But I think for me, it's just paying attention to life, right? It's a balance. It's kind of like praying and doing, or acting and just being. So it's always those antenna up. And usually, for me, it's not been linear. It's paying attention. Or I would, once the kids came back from college and I had more time to do something else besides go out the door and work on the farm. And out of the blue, a woman called, and all these things for me have been like out of the blue, or like my little Irish elder friend says, God winks.
Yeah.
And said, I want you to run for an office on the Iowa Corn Promotion Board. And I said, no, I'm too busy and blah, blah, blah. She said, it's the best work I've ever done with the best people I've ever worked with. She set the hook. And then just reading and seeing and I really believe if you see it, you can be it. So seeing other women leadership in agriculture in the local paper, and I think, gosh, that would be so cool, right? So many hooks, but I think just paying attention to the universe speaking to me.
Which is perhaps happening less and less as people are scrolling on their phones in every spare moment and things like that. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, we may never see the great philosophers anymore. If Newton had had a phone, he wouldn't have seen the apple fall from the tree. He wouldn't have noticed.
Right. And yes, and for me, this time in my life, there are so many philosophers or so many deep thinkers I want to read. It's like I don't have enough time in the day. I'll wake up at 3:00 in the morning and think, oh, I should go read this.
Yeah.
Because life is so short and there's so many cool things out there to think about.
So
and to do.
Absolutely. And to contribute through, right? And so
Yes.
if we think about, I guess, younger women, but women in general who are heading into finding themselves in the early stages of non-traditional leadership roles, where it's typically been men, maybe generations of men in those leadership roles. What are some of the lessons that you've learned forging some of that ground and founding new organizations, actually? Or was that not the case? Was the industry just entirely welcoming? Did you have to do things
No.
differently because you're a woman?
Yes. So I had great training, right? I grew up with three brothers. I have two sons. So I'm quite comfortable in the world of men,
Yeah.
but you have to work longer, harder, smarter, read, um, and prove yourself over, always auditioning, and you can't play the woman card. So, um, yeah, it was difficult. And I'd have to say, Simon, some of the most rewarding things I've heard is when a young woman or a woman of any age will come up to me and say, um, I've read about you. How can I start? What can I do? Or have people come up and say, I'm here because of you.
Mm.
That to me is one of the life's biggest rewards, is touching other people, passing it forward. You know, um, I, part of succession is looking behind in your wake of your boat, right? In life. And are you leaving a trail of damage? Or are you leaving things better than they were? And are you encouraging people? And are you expanding this whole web of network of people to make the world a better place? And I think it's great calling.
Yeah. I love that. I love that metaphor for people to hold in their head as you look back. Are you leaving a trail of damage or are you leaving a trail of better? It's a great measure of a life, right? As the life moves through the world, did it leave a trail of damage or did it leave a trail of better behind it? It's interesting, when you said don't, you can't play the woman card. And I don't know if this will be topical for people or not, but the world needs a balance or an equality of leadership, both male and female. We can't have completely testosterone fueled leadership. That can lead to some interesting things, but um, we actually need women who are in leadership roles to bring the dimensionality as well that comes from them being women, as opposed to let's do it the way the men do it kind of thing. And I think there's some great examples of that, worldwide. I suspect there's some resilience that was built for you to be able to do this. I'm going to go back to the farming crisis of the 80s, and then I don't know what the hog market collapse was. We don't call them hogs in Australia, so even saying hog market collapse feels strange to me. I think 1998 or something. Farming is a tough life for anyone that's never been on a farm.
Mhm.
It's a tough life. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I suspect that's because of years of farming, and the land just demands that of you. What what are the what was the crisis of the 80s and the hog market collapse? And I suspect there's some deep lessons of resilience that you've acquired over the years that might be useful for people to kind of hear about.
For sure, resilience. And, I was married to this wonderful man who was such a man of character. And if you're farming, you just expect during the day, there's going to be a whole lot of things that go right. But there's also going to be a whole lot of things that go wrong that are out of your control. So you got a choice. How are you going to react? Are you going to blow up? Or are you just going to put your shoulder to the wheel and fix things? And are you going to yell at people? I mean, this is like for any business, right? Are
Yes.
you going to take it out on other people? Or are you going to suck it up and be a person of character, right? And, you know, I could talk for a long time about the crisis, and certainly the crisis of the 80s was horrible, but we were both sixth generation farmers. So we had heard the stories of the Depression.
Yes.
So, you live within your means. We always, saved and bought a little bit or expanded a little bit and lived within your means because you know There were times that were going to come along that you were going to have to really buckle down and be frugal and budget. And even though you did that, there were a lot of good people who went out of business, and that hurts. It almost is like survivor guilt, right? Because those people were working hard also. So yes, resilience, and then just how to be a better person, right?
It's interesting. If you look at the business world, um, a business leader losing control and yelling and screaming at their team fundamentally is a loss of control. It's not the indication of a person that people would want to follow, as opposed to the person that focuses on the issue and said, what do we have control over? And there's a lot you don't have control over in farming, not least of which is the weather, right? You have absolutely no control over the weather. But one of the things that people might not realize about farming is that it's big business. It's high tech business. It's driven by science and technology today more than ever, but actually forever it's been driven by a degree of science. My uncles, on the farm all knew what the weather was going to be way before the the meteorological group could forecast it. They had a science built into their brain about what it took to grow a crop or to increase the yield or whatever. And you worked in the final mapping of the corn genome, and that was a turning point in agricultural science. I loved what you said before about I want to pursue, and I'd love everybody just to kind of hold this in mind. You said you're always interested in pursuing things that put a sparkle into your brain. I think I love that analogy, and I think getting involved in the corn genome mapping put a sparkle in your brain. Getting involved in the science. Can we lean in a little bit on farming, and because we're also going to end up in a conversation about food security. It's such a critical dimension of any society. But can you lean in a little bit on technology and science and your involvement in mapping the corn genome? First of all, I hadn't even heard the term corn genome until I read this, but I'd love you to lean in a little bit on the technology and science of farming, because it's big business with lots of money spent on it.
Yeah, so having a career as a nurse, I always loved science, right? And so we were fortunate at Iowa Corn. We had a research committee, and that was where I went to have my brain sparkle. Right. And we had a consultant who was excellent from a big business who went out on his own. And the rice genome had been mapped, and this little weed, Arabidopsis, had been mapped. And he said, we have to get funding to map the corn genome so we can fully open up the potential of what corn can do, because, of course, it's a national treasure. Like, I think agriculture is a national treasure, and so is corn. I mean, I won't go there. You can do almost everything with corn, right? And so that was one of the times when we're sitting on the table, and he said, well, who would be interested in helping in this project? And I said, I would love to do this. So I spent a lot of time going to maize genetic conferences with people with PhDs, and who would get up like for days, talk about things. And every hour there were maybe 4 or 5 words I even recognized, because it was, epigenetics and SNPs and SNAPs and all these things. So my role there, and it kept expanding because they actually decided they liked me and they would give me some time on the stage, was to explain why what they did was so important to farmers in the end game. And to me, that was a great relationship. I had one of the young women scientists say, I said, go talk to your neighbors over the fence. Once you dumb down your language so you can talk to your neighbor over the fence about what you do and why it's important, we're all going to be better off. Someone went home and had a great conversation with my dad and explained to him what I did and why it was so important. And then we took that same kind of paradigm and went to the halls of Congress and pounded those halls to convince people why it was important for their constituents, wherever they were, why this research was so important. It needed to be a public and private partnership to get it done, and talked about food security and all the issues that go with it. So yeah, those were great days. You love it when you have a success, right?
Yeah.
And you see the needle move. And now it's still going, and it's going into phenomics and all of the things that can happen. And then other crops came along and also got their genomes mapped.
Yeah. It's an interesting paradox that has a direct application to business as well. Um, People that have a complex thing that they do usually miss out on two key components of communication. And if you have a complex thing that you do, communication needs to be a superpower, because most people do not want to spend time understanding complexity. And so the first thing you've got to be able to communicate is why this even matters, which is what they asked you to do. It doesn't need any technical explanation or anything else. It's just, why does this need to matter at an end game kind of viewpoint? And then the second one is, how can you simplify this in a way that everybody will get it? Simplification is the greatest form of sophistication we actually have in communication. So how can you simplify this so that everybody would get it? Because it's, I've done a lot of work with the Department of Agriculture and Food here in Western Australia. One of the scientists there created a whole new breed of apple called the Pink Lady, because, people wanted crispier red apples, right? And so, over years of growing, cuts and things like that at the back of their office, actually, they managed to create this reproducible apple. I think that's the thing with farming. How do you create a reproducible, particularly grown crop, as opposed to, livestock and things like that? But you talked about pounding the halls of Congress, and that brings us into this private-public partnership space, policy space. You're involved in the 2014 Farm Bill. What are the lessons?
I think it started out, Simon, I think it started out as a 2012 Farm Bill, and we finally got it done.
Well, I think that's one of the first things people need to understand about policy.
Yes.
It's a long time for it to happen. But what were some of the things you learned once you stepped into that public-private space? And there are fundamental differences, right? The private space is driven by, hey, let's make a decision and earn more money. The public space is multiple bottom lines, and everybody's judging, and everybody has a right to have an opinion, even if they're not invested financially or other ways. What did you learn that you had to kind of do differently, aside from patience, as you worked with Congress to try and get these bills up and get this support to occur?
I think it's a lot what we just talked about with the scientific community. It's communicating. I love communicating, and I love relationship building. So here's what we're going to do. Here's why we need the funding, and here's why you should care, and explain it in terms they can understand. Now I forgot the gist of your question. I had something else to say now.
Yeah, so some of the things you've learned about operating that public-private space.
Trust.
Yeah, trust.
Trust. Building trusting relationships, once it's like growing up in a small community, once you burn your family name, you don't get it back, and neither do your kids, right? In the same way with an organization. So National Corn Grower Association had a great reputation, and we attack the issue and not the person.
Yeah.
So refreshing. I would love to see that today, right?
Yeah.
So we worked together on the issues and then built trust and built relationships. You don't get things done the first time you visit, and you be genuine and you be authentic, right?
Yeah. I love that
statement. Your story. You tell your story, you stay in your safe harbor. You don't pretend to be somebody you're not. Liberating to say, if someone asks you, to say, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. Building those relationships. Yeah.
I love that. I love the statement, if you burn your family name, you don't get it back, and neither do your children. I think
Mhm.
that check the box. That's an important thing to remember. Safety, trust and safety are human qualities, and everybody wants someone to make them safe in some way. It that what was the Farm Bill of 2014?
It's terrible. I've forgotten the formal name of it.
Yes.
But so corn growers, we start our policy at the grassroots level. So we have meetings in communities and we get farmers together. They come together for a meal. We say, what are your big issues? What do you need the government to do for you? Because the government needs to do certain things that you can't do for yourself, and even
Mm.
groups of farmers or even organizations can't do for you. So, um, for example, people told us, risk management, crop insurance, um, being able to have a safety net, so if you can't, so you can hopefully try and farm the next year. Conservation programs, also feeding the poor. A large part of the farm bill still is today, was then, was why is it so important to feed the poor? And going back to your local community, this is what I loved about National Corn Growers, that John Doggett made us think. He gave us homework. You go back to your community and you see how many kids are hungry. Uh, 1 out of 5 kids in Iowa is hungry in the breadbasket of the US. And if that doesn't do something to you, you're a pretty cold-hearted person, right? So why do we need the SNAP program? We need the SNAP program because for many reasons, to feed the hungry, but also it's a market for farmers, thinking about yourself. But it's the right thing to do. And you can't pass a farm bill if you don't build coalitions. So once again, back to building those coalitions. So if I'm talking to a congressman or a senator from New York or urban areas, why is the farm bill important to them? What are you hearing? My question to them is, what are you hearing from your constituents? What keeps them up at night? Totally different from what my 1% of the population thinks about. We need to think about each other and what our needs are so we can build these coalitions, so we can pass the farm bill. Same issues today, right?
Yeah.
If you only think about yourself, the world's a pretty sad place and things don't get done.
Yeah. And you have natural opponents to what you're doing when you only think about yourself. That senator in New York has people who are hungry in the community. There is common ground across all areas. That leads us into trade diplomacy and the global perspective. So you've been treading the halls of Congress, but then establish MAIZALL and international trade. I mean, farming is such a complex industry because they're buying and selling on international markets. That kind of brings the whole trade diplomacy thing into play. It certainly gets used as political porn sometimes. We won't buy your stuff, etc. We've had that in Australia with other countries that we deal with over the years. What did you learn on the international stage with MAIZALL and just the whole international trade diplomacy around agriculture?
Oh my goodness. That was one of the, I don't know, most rewarding things in my life was to help bring that to fruition and birth that MAIZALL group. So, the officers of the Grains Council and the officers of National Corn went to Argentina to study the competition. Well, what we found out there was we had the same issues with acceptance of technology, acceptance of biotechnology, trade issues, non-tariff barriers, phytosanitary issues that were used as trade barriers and not really something. So we talked with them and they said, we should go talk to the Brazilians. And we said, well, would you go with us? Sure. So we went together, talked to the Brazilians. I walked into that first formal dinner and sat down, and the president of the Brazilian Corn Grower Association sat down beside me. He said, I know everything about you. I know everything that National Corn does. And we so respect the reputation of the national corn growers and what you do. And so they were in with us. So the world's three greatest competitors for selling corn, very rare thing. And it goes back to all those things: communication, a safe place to be together and talk, and trust. I mean, we built relationships. Those guys are my brothers. They're like my brothers, right? And then we traveled around the world together. And we went to the World Trade Organization and sat down with the Chinese and said, we don't want to have formal sanctions against you, but here's the issue. And then we went to the Food and Ag Organization in Rome and explained it, just what we've done, explained why agriculture is so important, why it's a national treasure for everybody. But we can't just have subsistence farming. We cannot deny farmers who farm in Africa access to technology that I have, because if I don't have a crop, it's a crop failure. If the woman I met in Africa doesn't have a crop, her children go hungry. So I got to pinch myself at the tables I sat with, at the issues we worked on. And, we say, we didn't solve all the world's trade problems, but we planted seeds, and it can be done. And we had, people in governments say to us, this is so rare for competitors who collaborate and work together, and they would listen to us. I mean, we went in these rooms, and where are you going to get your corn from, right? If you're not going to buy from the three biggest competitors. But yeah, I don't have words to describe what that was for me, and still is.
Yes. Well, the story about the Argentinians, they were judging you based on the character that the National Corn Growers Association had already forged. And so they were judging you on your history before you even showed up in the room, which is kind of an important thing for people to remember. Your history precedes you. Your reputation walks into the room before you do. And so much has happened before you even arrive, based on who you are and how you've carried yourselves and the character of the individual or the organization. I'd love to talk about food security and agriculture a little bit. A lot of people don't really, necessarily have a deep understanding of farming. And this is, your and my opportunity for people to understand who and what farmers are. You made an interesting parallel. If you don't have a great season, that's a business issue. But if a lady in Africa doesn't have a great crop, they just go hungry. Food security is a national issue in every country, and should always be a national issue, because you've got to be able to feed the nation. What would you share with people if we were just generally, now we have a very wide variety of people that listen to these podcasts? What would you want to say about farmers and farming in particular that maybe people don't really fully appreciate or understand, and why we should listen loudly if we live in an urban area and something's in the press about farmers they've driven all their trucks down the freeway to protest a particular thing or something like that. We should all listen a little more attentively when something's happening to do with agriculture and farming.
And I think it works both ways. So farmers also need to listen to consumers. We always said we need to educate the consumer. Well, honestly, we need to sit down and have a conversation and build that relationship and talk about what are your concerns. And then don't expect farmers to farm the way our grandparents did, because you don't live the way your grandparents did. Are you willing to give up your phone and your computers and all the technology? Because we farm with technology, so there is food security. There are more computers in our tractors and harvesters, combines, sprayers than most people have in a small business in the offices, right? And it is to make farming safer, make food safer, make farming more efficient. I love going out now and this spring planting and riding with my sons and looking at the technology, and it's just mind blowing. So mapping the soil, we have soil maps, and so the amount of seed you put in, everything is precision and prescriptive. How much you put on. If you're driving in a field that has point rows, that planter shuts off like row by row by row, so nothing overlaps. It is just amazing. So I say to some people, come to the farm. But if you have issues, talk to people who do it. And don't expect people to have 2 cows, 5 chickens, a couple pigs, and a few sheep anymore and think that we're going to, and that's fine for some people, but that's not going to feed every nation, and that's not going to feed the world, right?
Yeah.
So I say, for all of us, just be open to having those conversations about what bothers you, why do I do this the way I do, and how the advancement, the science is there for a reason. We'd be stupid if we didn't take advantage of all the things that have been learned and discovered, and diseases solved, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, when you unpack farming from a business perspective, these are very complex business enterprises. You talked about the tractors and combines, etc., carrying more onboard technology than a small business would have in its entire office. It's true. They're high capital cost enterprises because that equipment all has a life and then it dies. It just dies because it's operating in harsh environments. It has a high operational cost. When you put in a crop, the seed has to be purchased, and in many respects, as I said before, sometimes farmers are the biggest gamblers on the planet because, certainly with a wheat farm, rain at the wrong time of year can take the entire yield out. Or you're dry seeding when you typically would like to have had some water in the soil before you plant, and now you're running on, a chemical seed. They're high-tech, complex, high-cost, high-investment enterprises year after year after year. And you have been managing the transition to the next generation, which is your sons. But transition is
and their wives.
Yes, that's
and
true.
The women. Don't forget the women.
Yes, you should. That's true. You've got to pull me up on that because they work just as hard, and they're out in the field and they're doing the work and many other things as well. And this idea of transition, not just for a family in business. What do you do if the next generation of the family does not want to be in the family business? But it's true for any business, where you've had a really successful CEO or leader. The farm was obviously led by your husband, and then you as you've transitioned it. But, what have you learned about the transition to the next level of leadership as you've been going through this process? It's not a 5-minute thing. It happens over years. But what are some of the passing the baton kind of lessons that you might share with us?
It doesn't happen overnight. So, like any succession that's going to be successful, has to be planned for and have everybody at the table, an even table where people can talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the things we've talked about previously, Simon. It's communication, trust, and relationship building, and conflict resolution, right? You're in a business, any kind of business. It's you have to manage people, right? You have to manage yourself first of all, and then you have to be able to bring out the best in people. And sharing knowledge, I mean, to me, that's another thing that makes my brain sparkle, is having the wisdom of the older generations, multi-generational farms, and having the wisdom there and the historical knowledge, but then bringing all of that energy and new technology and network of not only friends who are in agriculture, but their contacts, whether it's agronomists or whoever expands the field to make you successful. And it's kind of like Maurice used to say about farming: if it was easy, anybody could do it, right? Well, succession is not easy. And I've just, Reese has been dead now for 9 months. So going through all this, the legal framework, and have a wonderful attorney. And I asked him questions, and he said, well, not everybody does this like you, right? You have to be able to let go.
Mm.
You've gotten to a certain part of your life, and you don't need to retire completely, because we probably wouldn't have. We probably would have kept working, but you have to let go along the way and not be a control freak and not control your farm or your kids or whoever takes over your business from the grave. And I told him from the get-go, I do not want to be a 95-year-old lady who's turning over my farm to 70-year-old kids or 65-year-old kids, right? And that's what happens a lot. That's a travesty to everybody, right? So, yeah, it's character building. It's
Yeah.
all those things we talked about, Simon. It's, what are you leaving? What's your legacy? What are you leaving? What are you leaving personally? What are you leaving as a business?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting when a farm transitions to the children, you're transitioning that business into a hardwired value system. Certainly, in Australia, we're seeing the aggregation of lots of small farms into large corporate farming companies. And so the community-based aspect of farming is disappearing with that, because they're broad acre, they've gone from 3,500 acre farms to 25,000 acres. And the community is not actually important. And so I think one of the questions for leaders is, how do I transition this in a way that has the values hardwired that we've built so much of this on? And you're right. With MAIZALL, you were one of the founders of it, but how do we let it go now? And the next group of people are going to lead it. Have we done enough to hardwire the values? Is a really interesting question.
And will they keep up the relationship building?
Yeah.
Because it's like your baby, and the business is like your baby. You've invested everything in it, right?
Yes.
And so I had a hard conversation when I left MAIZALL and said, basically, this is a really good thing. Don't mess it up.
Absolutely. Well, Pam, I could talk about farms and farming, but for hours, but this is not really about farms and farming. This is about business and enterprise and organizations. And I think, are you leaving carnage behind you, or are you making it better as you look back on the path? I love the idea of, what sparkles your brain. And, so much of your conversation is based on values. Let's just actually have a conversation and figure out what is going to serve, most or everyone. When you find the common benefit to everybody, complex, contentious issues become easier to sort out. But when the agenda is always from an individual perspective, then collaboration has to become competition, and that seldom leads to a great outcome. I usually wrap up with 2 or 3 quick questions just to get a quick, off the cuff response from you, and I'd love to wrap up with that. If you're game, just for a couple of quick questions. So,
sure.
If there was one mystery or unanswered question in the world, and it can be in any area that you choose, one mystery or unanswered question that you'd love to be able to find or know the solution for, what would that be, and why? Why that particular thing?
How do we bring together disparate thoughts, disparate people, different cultures? How do we start looking more open-mindedly at each other? And what does that ask of me? What does that ask of each of us? Is, how do we get to a place where maybe I was naive, but I think we used to be, right? And how do we get to that place so, I said sometimes when I was National Corn Grower president, I feel like I spend 99% of my time trying to get people to get along
Yeah.
and 1% of my time getting the work done.
Yeah.
Where would we be if we could just sit down together and get the work done?
Yeah. And why can't we manage to do that? If you could have invented anything in the world that actually has already been invented, what would you love to have invented because it would have challenged your brain and required you to really think through it? Anything at all?
It would be scientific discoveries, like curing cancer.
Yeah. Perfect. And then what's the last book you've read and loved? Do you love reading books? Do you love reading, some of the books around philosophy? What's the last book you've read and loved?
I love reading books. I've been reading a lot of David Brooks or Arthur Brooks. And, it's kind of like a web. You go around a thread and then, Rudolph Otto or philosophers who I just discovered the word numinous from Rudolph Otto, like numinous and luminous, like living in light, but being a light and living in awe and just be silent enough to live in that awe. And the world just opens up like unbelievable. So, yes, I love to read.
That feels like a fabulous place for us to end, being silent enough to live in awe of the world. I suppose as opposed to the opposite, which is making so much noise, you don't see what's amazing around you. Pam, thank you so much for taking the time to share this with you. I really, really appreciate it. And, I'd encourage everybody that listens to this episode, look through the lessons into how they apply to you, your business and what you do, or to the journey that you're on. And whether, you leave carnage behind you or a greater contribution that leaves better behind you. And I'd encourage everyone to kind of become fully aware of the importance of what farmers do, farming, and this high-tech, challenging world of food production that every nation needs. So, Pam, thank you so much. Thank you for all of the work you've done through the various organizations, and thank you for giving us this time today.
Yeah, thank you. It was great, and I consider it. I'm so grateful for what life has put on my plate, and then to be able to share it with you and your audience. So, thank you.
Thank you.